Hey everyone. I talked about this on Twitter a little bit, and some people seemed really interested. Excuse me. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about the history of the Baptist faith and message, which is the main confession of faith for Southern Baptists in particular, but is used by a lot of other Baptist conventions in America, but in different parts of the world. It shows up a good amount in Africa, if I'm not mistaken, in different Baptist conventions. And it's an interesting document. It's had three major phases, or sort of like existences. It was first written in 1925, it was revised in 1963, and then re-revised in 2000. And that's the current document that the Southern Baptist Convention uses, the 2000 Baptist Faith and Message. And the interesting thing, though, is that a lot of conventions besides the SBC that use the Baptist Faith and Message don't actually use the 2000 version. They use the 1963 version. And that includes my own convention, the Baptist General Convention of Texas. So I thought it'd be interesting to take a little bit to talk about why many conventions, but also myself, prefer the 1963 Baptist Faith and Message to the 2000 revision. So the original 1925 Baptist Faith and Message, again, was a document produced by the Southern Baptist Convention in response to certain churches having strong internal disputes about evolution, and if Christians could believe in evolution. And so some of the parties involved in sort of making decisions for Southern Baptists writ large wanted to get together and adopt a statement of faith that the Southern Baptist Convention didn't have at that point in 1925. But it was very important to them that what they produced didn't infringe on the liberty of any individual church or the ability of any individual Baptist believer to express their religion as they see fit, or to follow truth as they found it. That's good. So, what they did was basically take a survey of what the vast majority of Southern Baptist churches believed, and they used that as the basis for their confession of faith. It was a very descriptive, short little document. It was based on an earlier sort of conventional statement of faith by a group in New Jersey, if I'm remembering right. I could be wrong on that. Look it up. But the main point was the 1925 version is pretty brief, and it is only meant to say this is what, at this time, the majority of Southern Baptists believed. There was no punishment for not believing it. There was no sort of mandate to subscribe to it. It was just a statement of, generally, this is what a Southern Baptist tends to believe. And it worked pretty well. It did kind of quell the controversy, even though, interestingly, it didn't actually address the evolution controversy at all. It just sort of made statements broadly about the rights of sort of individual Christians to believe as they see fit. So the evolution controversy kind of kicks up again in the 1960s. There is, I've got it in my notes, I'll find it, but there's a Southern Baptist professor named Ralph Elliott, who in 1961, he works at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He writes a commentary on Genesis called The Message of Genesis, a Theological Interpretation. And he says a few things in there that strike some people really the wrong way. He suggests the first 11 chapters aren't literal history, they're sort of a theological history. He suggests that the lifespan of various characters in the book of Genesis is exaggerated. They wouldn't have really lived that long. And then he, I think most controversially, suggests God probably didn't actually tell Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Instead, Abraham just thought that, and God stopped him from acting on this sort of misinterpretation. So, there's a big controversy. There's lots of debates on this. And to try and quell the controversy, the Southern Baptist Convention decides to draft a remaking of this statement of faith, a new revision of it. And so they expand it some. The 1963 version is more, I would say, theologically sophisticated. If that doesn't sound too sort of, I don't know, classist, what would that be? It's a more careful document. But it doesn't really change the theology of the 1925 Confession very much. It more is a way to state how Baptists are going to relate to the Bible. It refuses to address questions of inerrancy, much like the 1925. The Bible's called authoritative, but that's not especially qualified. And as a way to kind of get around some of these sort of stickier questions about, like, historicity of portions of Genesis, there's this statement that's kind of vague, but is really liked by a lot of people, that the central hermeneutical, or like the central principle that we read the Bible through, is Christ. Now, what does that mean in practice? That's kind of like up for debate. Different people are going to read that different ways, but it's broad enough language that it pretty much makes everyone happy. In the Southern Baptist Convention in the 60s, again, liberty was sort of this big cardinal virtue for them. And so they liked this sort of statement of respect for Christ and deference to Christ is the thing that binds us all together as Baptists in our reading of Scripture, even if we differ on particulars of that. There were a few other revisions that they made to it. There was a section, probably most interesting, on academic freedom that was new and added, that basically stated, I thought I had a quote somewhere in my notes, if you'll give me just a second. Sure. So this note was added in the section called On Academic Freedom, specifically to address that controversy with Eliot's commentary. In Christian education, there should be a proper balance between academic freedom and academic responsibility. Freedom in any orderly relationship of human life is always limited and never absolute. The freedom of the teacher in a Christian school, college, or seminary is limited by the preeminence of Jesus Christ, by the authoritative nature of the Scriptures, and by the distinct purpose for which the school exists. I think that's a pretty good little section. I like that a lot. And then the other main change they did is a little bit obscure. They rewrote the section on the church because the 1925 version of it sounded a little bit landmarky, which is its own kind of interesting idea in Baptist history we'll talk about, but they rewrote it to kind of get out of that. Again, the main issue with the 1963 Faith and Message was that it wasn't meant to be prescriptive, this is what you have to believe at a church. It was written as a sort of snapshot of what Baptist churches tended to believe in that time. All the churches that call themselves Southern Baptists generally believe these things, and so our statement of faith is just that. It's a statement of things that the vast majority of Baptist churches believe. Now, there's a big shift in how the Baptist Faith and Message is thought about moving on into the 2000 revision. So you may know, I mean, it's a bigger deal in just sort of general religious history, that the Southern Baptist Convention has a strong conservative shift in starting in the late 70s, going all the way up through the early 2000s, still effective today, obviously. Getting there. And as you get this shift to make the convention more doctrinally defined better, in 2000, the committee that's responsible for this drafts a new revision of it that is substantially longer than the earlier two. Each version's been a little bit longer than the last, but the 2000 is a very long document compared to kind of the 1925 version and even the 63 extension of that. And it adds a lot of sections that weren't covered in the original document. It adds sections on the family, on women in ministry. It greatly expands the section on scripture. I'm remembering other statements on like military service and things like that. Just some very specific homosexuality and abortion. It gets very specific. And the reason for the 2000 convention, the 2000 revision, is that it was purposefully trying to be a little bit more of an exclusive document. So at that time, you still did have a decent number of Southern Baptist churches that would have supported things like women in ministry, that would have been more egalitarian in their gender politic than complementarian. And so, sorry, lost my train of thought a little bit there. And so they were hoping the 2000 version would mandate more. If you're a Southern Baptist, this is what you must believe. Sort of take it or leave it. If you believe elsewise, you're not a Southern Baptist. And like I said, it's different because the things they put in there weren't necessarily things that were common to all Baptist churches. More than 50% probably, but a pretty sizable number of churches wouldn't have. Remember, even in the 60s, Southern Baptist churches are like ordaining women. That's a decently sort of long tradition there. So that's where we're at today. Certain conventions, like my own Texas Baptist Convention, that like the gist of it, but object to some of the stuff in the 2000 revision, still hold to the 1963 faith and message is what we hold to. Like my convention, which is theologically conservative generally, but does have female ministers in it, so we use the 63. And I guess I just wanted in this last section maybe briefly talk a little bit about like some of the specific theological statements that caused me to prefer the 63 to the 2000 revision. And the first big one, and the really obvious one, is Scripture. So the 2000 revision of the Baptist Faith and Message wanted to get, I guess we could say, more technical and more specific in its doctrine of Scripture. And that is a thing I think that we need to at least take seriously before we kind of lampoon, because people in my world can do that a little bit sometimes, that the 63 Faith and Message is not a very specific document in what it claims. Like we said earlier, this statement about the key to interpreting Scripture is Jesus. What does that mean? It's not super clear how that affects how you actually read, an Old Testament text. So I can't call it inherently bad from the 2000 version to get more specific on what they're actually saying. But I think it could be argued, and I would argue, that the 63 was pretty purposeful in being broad like that, to try and preserve the sort of Baptist ideal of the liberty of the local church over and against sort of super church structures. The 63 Faith and Message... Oh, sorry about the dogs. So the 63 Faith and Message... Dogs, can you give them a sec? I'm gonna finish my lemon. So the 1963 Baptist Faith and Message calls Scripture the record of God's revelation. It's an almost Bardian statement, but what it really is kind of some wiggle room in how you relate the authority of Scripture and the authority of Christ. So that's what that does. That gets taken out. So instead of Scripture being the record of God's revelation, like the 1963 Faith and Message, and the 2000 Faith and Message, Scripture is God's revelation. So that the record of is removed. Sorry, the bottom parts of the lemon are the most sour. So this last little bit's a lot. It also removes that statement that the criterion by which the Holy Bible is to be interpreted is Jesus Christ. That gets removed. Again, that's a statement I like, even as I recognize it's not a very clear statement, but it is a good way to manage, I think, sort of theological liberty, which is kind of what our denomination is built around conceptually. As I mentioned before, the sections on the church and the section on men and women I both find theologically objectionable, and those are both bigger issues, but basically I do think that biblically women can be pastors. I don't think the kind of complementarian that the 2000 Faith and Message envisions is a necessary way to read Scripture, or even maybe the most accurate way of reading Scripture. And so, I don't like those. I don't necessarily like the section Christians in the Social Order how very explicit it gets on various political issues. There's benefits to the church speaking politically, that's obvious, but it seems to me to single out abortion and homosexuality as issues of like special Christian concern in a way that I don't really understand why those get highlighted as the pressing questions of Christians' relationship to the social order. So that, broadly speaking, is why I prefer the 1963 Baptist Faith and Message to the 2000. To summarize, the big issue is that the 1963 Baptist Faith and Message is a very descriptive document. It does a very nice, I think, job of capturing where Baptists were in that time and where a lot of Baptists are now. I think it's a much broader, more inclusive document. I think the very fact that it was written to be descriptive gives it a lot of usability as a document, whereas in the 2000 version, was purposefully written to be more exclusive. And in that it's not as accurate a reflection on what most Baptists actually believe. Even those like me who aren't part of the Southern Baptist Convention, but have kind of cultural associations with it. And there are specific statements I think are done not as well in the, the 2000s specifically. Scripture, the family, the church, and Christians in the civil order. Thank you. Comment below your favorite iteration of the Baptist Faith and Message. Are you a 1925 mad lad? Are you a 63 or die person? Or are you, are you down with the 2000 revision? Let me know in the comments. Remember to subscribe if you got an account and haven't done that yet. It always helps me out. Like, comment, share, retweet, and I will catch you guys next time.